Hey guys, it's Haley and welcome to another video. I could not say bookish because this is not a bookish video. If you read the title, you know I'm going to be talking about my all-time favorite horror movies in my 5K Q&A video. I asked you guys if you would want to know about my favorite horror movies because I did get some questions about my favorite movies and y'all said yes, you would love to see this video. So here I am bringing it to you. I hope the lighting is okay for this video. This is the first time that I'm filming in the dark. I've always filmed with natural lighting, and this is the first time I've ever filmed in like a literal dark room with just a ring light as light. So I hope this turns out okay. I might play around and turn on some lights. Okay, I cannot tell if this is better or worse. But here we are. So I am a horror movie aficionado, I would like to say. I've seen pretty much every horror movie ever made. It's very, very rare that I come across a horror movie I haven't seen. It's also very frustrating to try to find something to watch on Netflix with me because whoever I'm watching with will be like, what do you want to watch? And I'll be like, a horror movie. And then we'll go through and I'm like, seen it, seen it, seen it. Seen it. So yeah, that's just to say I've watched a lot of damn horror movies in my life, and these are my top 30 that I would recommend if you are looking for something to watch. On this list, I have the classics, obviously, because so many classic horror movies are my favorite, but I also have some underrated ones in there that you might not have heard of. So let's go ahead and get into it. The first movie I want to talk about is 9 Dead, and I actually watched this on Netflix in high school, so quite many years ago. I became immediately obsessed with it, and I've watched it probably 4 or 5 times since. I just keep going back to it because it has that gruesome, gory vibe that you like in like Saw and Hostel and movies like that, but it has a storyline and characters that you really feel invested in. It's not just for the gore of it all. It's basically like this big game, and these 9 people have to figure out if they want to sacrifice each other, kill the other people, or sacrifice themselves, because only one can get out alive. Next up, we have the Scream series. This is a classic and one of my favorite horror series ever. It's definitely in my top 5. If you're a fan of horror movies, then you know the big deal with Scream is that it's self-aware. It knows that it's a horror movie. In fact, it makes fun of itself. In almost every subsequent movie after the first one, they talk about the Stab movies, which is literally a parody of Scream itself. And I love when horror movies kind of call attention to the fact that they know what they are, they know what they're doing, they're aware of the tropes, and they're just gonna do it as fun as possible. I think aspects of comedy in a horror movie are absolutely essential. So if you haven't seen any of the Screams, I mean, you just gotta watch them. Next up, I would recommend The Strangers. And this one is actually on Netflix. I watched it recently and it was really disturbing. It's about a couple who goes to a wedding, I think, and they come back to their little Airbnb after the wedding. Obviously they're drunk, they're just kind of wanting to have a little nightcap and go to bed together. But some weird stuff starts happening, and there are some people outside the house that seem like they want to get in. If you are triggered at all by home invasions, definitely do not watch this. Home invasions scare me so much, and it's very rare that something scares me so much. So when I watched this movie, it really got to me. It really freaked me out, but I love things that scare me like that. So if you want a great home invasion horror movie, I would highly recommend this one. Next up, let's talk about another classic, the Halloween series. John Carpenter's Halloween is the movie that started the slasher genre. The horror movie genre that we know and love today is all credited by our darling final girl, Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis. I mean, this is just a classic. I watch it every Halloween, and if you haven't watched it, go watch it. I feel like you can watch it at any time of year. You do not need to watch this only on Halloween. And the series has gotten a little bit out of hand, in my opinion. I do like the original, the sequel, and the third one. After that, they do kind of go off the rails a bit, and the remakes are a lot. So just be aware of that if you go beyond the originals. Should we just take a pause and talk about my favorite horror movie ever? I feel like you might be surprised by this, but my favorite horror movie of all time and my favorite slasher series and my favorite slasher character, one of the most iconic characters in all of horror, in my opinion, is Child's Play / Chucky. This was the first horror movie I ever watched, and it started a deep love for this iconic, ironic, darkly comedic character that is this killer doll named Chucky. I think there is no better horror series than Child's Play. It is so just deep, and every single iteration that has been made starring Chucky, I love. I don't think they can go wrong with this series. The first three are like classic slashers turned on their head. They're very 80s vibes. They are classic slasher to the core. And then you have 4 and 5, which are The Bride of Chucky and The Seed of Chucky. And those just went full comedy, very self-aware, just like the Scream series. Absolutely love them. Jennifer Tilly is in them, and she is iconic. I have always wanted to be Tiffany, the Bride of Chucky, for Halloween, so maybe I'll do that next year. And after 4 and 5, you have 6 and 7, Cult of Chucky and Curse of Chucky, which happened some years after 4 and 5. Then you have the 2019 kind of reboot that reimagined Chucky as an AI kind of modern doll. I did enjoy that one. It was fun and entertaining, but it obviously can't touch the original series. And then finally, you have Chucky the FX show, which I have been absolutely loving this year. It is certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, so if you haven't seen that show and you love horror, definitely check it out. Next, I would recommend The Hills Have Eyes. These films were first imagined by Wes Craven, iconic horror writer, director, and producer, but I actually like the remakes better than the originals. I think they are so much more scary, so chilling. I think the acting is phenomenal. The remake of the first one and the sequel to the remake are really graphic. So prepare yourself. If you don't like graphic horror, definitely skip these, but they follow a family on a road trip and they end up in the middle of nowhere and they are attacked by inbred mutants that live in the hills. The next recommendation I have for you is I Spit on Your Grave. This is about a rape revenge story. A woman is staying alone in a cabin and is attacked by these local men. She is raped by them and left for dead. Little do they know, she is still alive and she will get her revenge and spit on their grave. Now, this is another super graphic horror movie with tons of trigger warnings, as you can probably imagine. But I think the first one is perfectly done. It's so good. Also, something funny about that movie is one of the evil rapists is the guy who plays Damien in Mean Girls, and it is just hilarious to be scared of him when he's such a funny, lovable character in one of my favorite childhood movies. But anyway, I think the first one is great. However, the second and third one are really just not as effective in my opinion. So I think you can skip those. When people talk about torture porn, those kind of horror movies, they are talking about I Spit on Your Grave 2 and 3. Those are just too much even for me. Next, I want to talk about an indie horror movie called Chained. It was made in 2012, and I actually found out about this book because it's what one of my favorite horror books, Brother by Anya Alborn was based on. It follows a little boy who becomes the apprentice of a serial killer, and it follows his dilemma as he grows up and tries to reconcile what he's been taught by really this father figure his whole life, and as he decides if he wants to be a serial killer like this man that he's been living with for so many years, or if he wants to break the cycle and make it right. Next up, I would call these modern classics, but the Sinister series is so good. One of my favorite horror series. If you like creepy children, paranormal stuff that you're not quite sure is paranormal, and things about like tapes, VHS tapes, I would highly recommend these. Obviously, there's trigger warnings. I can't say that enough. Please do not go into watching any of these movies unless you have looked at the trigger warnings. It's horror, it's gonna be terrifying, and I don't want anyone to get hurt going in without knowing what these movies involve, so just make sure you do your due diligence. I'm kind of covering my ass here because I don't want people to get mad at me. All of these movies are horribly graphic, and if you don't like horror, don't watch them. All right, now you're gonna have to hear me out for this next recommendation. That is The Terrifier. Cameron and I watched this one on Netflix a few years ago, right when it came out, and this is one that is so bad, it's good. And this is seriously one of my favorite horror movies of all time because it's just so tropey. It's such a caricature of what a slasher is or is supposed to be, and it basically follows this killer clown on Halloween night as he runs around murdering people, and obviously there's a final girl and she's trying to survive the night. It's just exactly what you want when you're looking for a slasher, and I don't hear anyone talk about this movie. It's really not well done, but it is so damn entertaining. Next up, I want to talk about some paranormal recommendations. The first one being the Conjuring series. I absolutely love these movies. I am not a big fan of paranormal horror all the time. Paranormal Activity, The Blair Witch Project, Amityville Horror, those are things you're not gonna see on this list of recommendations. However, the Conjuring movies have something a little bit different, and the magic that is the characters of Ed and Lorraine Warren, the paranormal investigators, is just so well done. Those characters are so interesting to me. So in the same vein, I would also recommend the Annabelle series. These movies are definitely a little bit more wild and wacky and comedic. They're not as truly terrifying, but boy are they fun, and you get to know more about Ed and Lorraine Warren because the Annabelle case is supposedly one of their haunting cases. I also just like the lore around the Conjuring and Annabelle movies because they're supposedly based on true hauntings. I don't know, they just really work for me. Next up, let's get into another classic, the Saw movies. I have seen every single Saw at least 3 times. I think me and Cameron watched them all through together twice, and I also watched them all through as a child twice. Some of the more modern remakes or extensions on the series get really convoluted and kind of take away from the original direction of the movies. So I definitely prefer the originals, but these have that element that I first fell in love with horror, which is that moral dilemma. If you don't know what Saw is about, these people who are not the best people or are finding their lives heading down a dead-end road suddenly wake up and they're in this contraption where they either have to do one bad thing or another, and it's kind of this dilemma of being between a rock and a hard place and having to choose the lesser of two evils and also push yourself to the extreme limit to escape this situation. And Jigsaw, the evil little guy who has set up these traps, is doing it to supposedly make these people better human beings. Is that true? It's debatable, but I love these movies. Next up, I have a more intellectual recommendation, and that is It Follows. This is about a curse that is transmitted like an STD. So basically, when you have sex with someone, you pass this curse onto them and they're gonna die and they can't get rid of it unless they have sex with somebody else. It is a big metaphor. It is very intellectual. If you want to intellectualize and analyze this entire movie, you definitely can, and I have spent way too many hours doing that. Or you can just take it as a fun and a really well-made horror movie on its face and enjoy it. Either way, I think it's a great one. Next up, I want to talk about The Invisible Man. This was the last movie that I've seen in theaters, if you can believe it. I saw it right before the pandemic started, and I absolutely loved it. It stars Elizabeth Moss, who is one of my very favorite actresses. She is just so fucking talented. And this movie sucks you in from the very beginning, wondering, is she being tormented by this invisible man? Is she just crazy? Is this a ghost? What is happening? And by the end, you're gonna have whiplash from the amount of twists, and it is so haunting, especially if you're a woman living alone or spending much time alone in your house. This one just like gives you the shivers after you watch it. Another more recent horror movie that's made it into my top faves is Hereditary. And honestly, I went into this movie knowing little to nothing, and I think it made even the very first few scenes hit so much harder to me. This is like a Karen Slaughter book. I think you should go in knowing little to nothing other than the trigger warnings if that's something you need to look at for yourself. Just know it is part paranormal, part psychological, very sinister, and super disturbing. Let's stay on the modern train. A Quiet Place and A Quiet Place 2, written by, directed by, and starring John Krasinski and his wife Emily Blunt. These movies are some of the best horror movies I think have come out in the past decade. The concept is so genius. It's about this post-apocalyptic world where you cannot make any noise because these monsters will come and find you. It's kind of like Bird Box, where you have to cover your eyes, and if you see something, you'll die. This is kind of the opposite of that, where if they hear you, you will die. I think these movies are so well done. I think they make you care about the characters so much. The characterization is amazing, and I think it's so much more than a horror movie. It's about this family trying to survive, and you are just rooting for them. They're also absolutely magical to watch in the theater because the theater is dead quiet. I mean, there are some scenes where I could hear a pin drop in the theater. They are so good. Next up, I want to recommend The Mist. This movie is based on a novella by Stephen King that I actually read this past Halloween. If you want to hear my full thoughts on the book and comparing it to the movie, I will link that vlog up here. But I would recommend the movie as well. It's about a man and his son hiding out in a grocery store as this mist rolls in, and anyone who leaves the seclusion of the grocery store is getting attacked by the things that live in the mist. So they have to figure out a way to escape, and horror ensues. You guys knew this one was gonna be on this list. Get Out. Come on. This is a modern classic in my opinion. And I also went into this movie knowing little to nothing. I was at my friend's house and some people randomly decided to rent it, and I sat down and watched it, and I was taken on the mindfuck of a lifetime. If you somehow have not seen this movie yet, I highly recommend it. It takes a new look at horror and this new spin on the genre, and it's really more about the horror of human nature and psychology and bias and racism than it is about horrifying creatures or paranormal things or stuff like that. So I think that is even more scary than like a creature feature. Let's get back into the classics. Another one of my favorite horror series is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies, but I actually have a hot take. I like the remakes better than the originals. I know, don't kill me. I just think the reimagined Leatherface is done so much better. The effects are so much more realistic in modern day cinema, and I don't know, I just like it. But of course, the originals still have a special place in my heart. I actually live about an hour away from where the original movie was filmed, and I've been to the gas station where it was filmed. You can actually visit it and be inside the van where most of the action was filmed. It was one of the most fun experiences I've ever had as a horror fan. So if you're in Texas, highly recommend that. Another classic I love is Nightmare on Elm Street. I mean, come on, Freddy Krueger is an iconic character. However, I've only seen the first one. I think I've seen the first one quite a few times, probably like 5 or 6, because hello, young Johnny Depp, come on. Fun fact, Wes Craven's daughter actually sat in on the casting for A Nightmare on Elm Street and said,
"Daddy, if you don't cast Johnny Depp in this movie, I'm going to run away from home."
And same girl. I think this movie is so good, not only because it's classic and it's a great slasher with a very unique character, with a very unique weapon, but also because it doesn't make the final girl stupid. She is the very first smart final girl. She sets traps for Freddy and she never falls down while she's running away from him. Next, I have kind of a weird recommendation. This one's on Netflix and it's called The Perfection. It is about these young violin prodigies that are held to this really impossible standard, and it devolves into these cultish kind of vibes, and that's all I want to give away. But this is another one where the twists will give you whiplash. It is so underrated. I never hear anyone talk about it. Probably my second favorite horror series behind the Chucky movies is Poltergeist. I have watched all of the Poltergeist movies probably a dozen times. I don't know, they are some of my comfort movies. I watched them growing up with my mom. I watched them on holidays with my family. I don't know, we're a weird horror family, and I will randomly watch them if I just need something on in the background, because Carol Ann is one of my favorite characters in cinema. The child actors in these movies are phenomenal. Every character is just so well characterized. You know exactly who they're supposed to be, and they all have this like funny undertone to them where you know exactly what box they fit in, and they're very aware that they fit in that box. Also, the horror is just insane. There's still imagery from this movie that sticks in my mind and makes my skin crawl. So if you haven't seen any of the Poltergeists, please watch them, especially if you like paranormal horror. Next up, I want to recommend Truth or Dare. This one is also on Netflix. It's about a sister. She is taking care of a sick relative and she needs money for his treatment. So she accepts this invitation to a place kind of like a Clue-esque dinner party where they play a game that gets more and more gruesome. This is another one that is really gory, so if you don't like graphic violence, definitely steer clear and make sure to look up the trigger warnings. But this is the one where the twist absolutely blew my mind. I could not believe it. I show this movie to everyone because the twist is just absolutely insane. So many people I show it to like say they saw it coming, but I'm the thriller queen and I did not. So I'm guessing a few of you won't either. Definitely check it out if you have Netflix. I mean, who doesn't? And the next recommendation I want to talk about is also on Netflix. It is called Call. It came out in 2020, so this is another recent favorite. And it follows 2 timelines of these 2 Korean women. This is also a Korean film, by the way. And they are connected by this phone. And one of them is in the past and one of them is in the present. So the girl from the past is calling this phone and the girl in the present gets to talk to her, and they're figuring out what happened in this house in the time between their 2 timelines. This is another one where the twist will give you absolute whiplash. It goes off the rails. It is insane. And it's another one I hear nobody talk about. It is super, super underrated. Let's just go ahead and stay on the Netflix train. Another one of my favorite modern horror movies is called Hush. And this one did get a lot of hype on the internet. Sometimes I think it's a little overhyped, to be honest, but it is really, really well done for a modern horror film. It is about a woman who is deaf, but a killer has broken into her house and is evading her by, taking advantage of the loss of one of her senses. Really cool that a disabled actor gets to have an opportunity to act in a horror film. And I think it's really well done. It's a really straightforward slasher where a woman has to kind of survive the night. But if you're looking for another classic slasher, that would be a great one. Now I'm gonna get into my more controversial favorites. And you guys, when you were asking for my favorite horror movies, I don't think you would have expected any of these to be on this list. But they're just so fucking weird. It speaks to that part of my soul that likes weird things. Like the reason why I like Bunny by Mona Awad. It's because it's just so fucking weird and you would never expect it. And these movies definitely have that. The first one is The Boy. It's about this haunted doll and this woman gets called in to take care of this doll, basically be a nanny for a doll because these two old people need someone to take care of their doll. Supposedly it represents their son who had passed away years ago, so obviously they're having some issues, but this girl's like, fuck it, I want to make some money, I'll go watch this doll for a few weeks, and horror ensues when she thinks the doll might actually be possessed. The next weird wreck I have is A Cabin in the Woods. This one starts out like your typical slasher. It kind of has Friday the 13th vibes, where you go in thinking it's going to be all of these teens going to a cabin in the woods, getting picked off by a killer one by one, but it slowly shifts into this mind fuck of a horror movie, and that's all I want you to know. Please watch it. In my opinion, this is a modern classic. I watched it in middle school and I did not understand it at all. And I watched it about 10 more times until I finally got what was going on and my mind was absolutely blown. Next up, I have another movie based on a Stephen King book, one of my favorite Stephen King books. I gave Pet Sematary 5 stars earlier this year and I recently watched the movie after and I absolutely loved it. Now, we're not gonna talk about Pet Sematary 2. We're just gonna pretend that that one didn't happen. But the Pet Sematary remake, I believe it came out in 2019, was so great. It's another weird one. It's very morbid. It's about zombie cats and a cemetery where you bury your pet and they come back alive, but just a little bit off, and how that concept can be pushed to its limit when you consider burying people there. And finally, the 30th horror movie in my top 30 favorite horror movies of all time is my last weird slash controversial pick, which is Don't Breathe. This is another one with an element that's similar to Hush. These teenagers break into this house of this war veteran and he is completely blind. So they think it's gonna be really easy to steal from him. But this blindness has caused him to have a really heightened sense of hearing, so you can't even breathe or he'll hear you. And because he was in the military, he is like out to get these kids. He can take out 25 of them at one time. It's no problem for him. But this is one that gets weird. It's not a straightforward slasher. It gets even creepier and goes in a direction that I definitely was not expecting, kind of similar to The Boy. And I just love when there's a twist that takes it about 10 notches darker than you thought it was gonna go. Again, trigger warnings, I'm saying. Please look them up and do not blame me if you are scared by these movies based on my recommendation. That is the point. I love to be scared. I hope that you love to be scared too. And I hope that you got a few good recommendations from this video. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.